Of course, the weekend I adopt 2 adorable kittens, it finally happens. It's been 12 goddamn years since Dungeon World was first published. In the time since, many jabronis have talked about the possibilities of a Dungeon World 2nd edition coming out. Some jabronis have even made their own 2nd edition. Sort of. That's a whole nother video. It's been sitting in my drafts for like 2 years. But on August 16th, veteran RPG designer Luke Crane announced that he and his business partner D'Amato SJ had bought the IP of Dungeon World from Adam and Sage, and they are going to start working on Dungeon World 2nd Edition. And by starting to work on Dungeon World 2nd Edition, I mean starting to work on Dungeon World 2nd Edition. Crane and D'Amato have literally only announced that they just plan on publishing Dungeon World 2E. They haven't done any writing for it, and it doesn't really seem like there's any sort of organization to the project either. Instead, Crane shared that he wants to preserve Dungeon World's accessibility and its sort of timeless fantasy RPG vibe. Other than that though, he's open to whatever the community suggests. And there have been a ton of suggestions. One of my favorite interactions was when someone suggested that Dungeon World 2E move farther away from D&D and try to establish its own identity, while the comment immediately following said they want even more D&D-isms because to them, that's kind of what Dungeon World is. I could totally further discuss that whole philosophy back and forth, but that is like a whole nother video, which is going to be the theme of this video. Let's get back on track though. Who is Luke Crane? Well, he wrote an indie RPG called The Burning Wheel and published it in 2002. It was one of the first ever role-playing games to encourage player-driven storytelling rather than the players and their characters kind of going along with whatever evil, twisted machinations the DM came up with. From what I understand in reading posts on the internet, Burning Wheel had a huge influence on what would become Powered by the Apocalypse. I mean, it makes sense. After all, Luke Crane knows Vincent Baker, who wrote Apocalypse World, which is the apocalypse upon which all derivatives are powered by. And Crane was, or is, friends with Adam Coble and Sage Latora, who wrote Dungeon World, and he even watched it go from a Kickstarter to the wildly, relatively popular phenomenon that it is today. He's also subject to a scandal, but we'll cover that in a sec. Crane's written a lot more than just Burning Wheel, and he'll be the first one to let you know. The man's also written RPGs such as Mouse Guard, Torchbearer, and Miseries and Misfortunes, to just name a few. To cap off his ethos, if that's the correct term, he's been selling Dungeon World in its physical form through his Burning Wheel store since like 2016. So the man has credit to develop the 2nd edition to my favorite role-playing game. Crane initially mentioned that he had always wanted to write a 2nd edition to Dungeon World ever since he got sort of the publishing rights to it in 2016. But then Tuesday, he said that he wasn't going to be the one designing it, and neither was D'Amato SJ. I write this. So much for the whole waiting 8 years to write a 2nd edition to Dungeon World. In fact, he claimed he didn't even know who the designer was going to be before he threw out the idea of it being designed by a collective. Which is suspicious given his history. Look at that, we're going from kind of honest games journalism to trashy drama in the same video. Now, in case you don't know the history of why this is weird and suspicious, beyond the fact that it's already kind of weird and suspicious, we have to dig in a little bit to an even bigger scandal in the indie RPG world. Remember that Adam Coble guy that I mentioned earlier in the video? I'm sure most of you do, but in case you don't, he's a bit of a pariah in the RPG scene. He's one half of the team who wrote Dungeon World, in case you couldn't infer by what I had said earlier in the video, and he sort of carved out a reputation as being like a champion of like safety tools and making sure everyone at your table is comfortable with stuff and, you know, kind of being a good person. This reputation became tarnished in March of 2020, like right before the world ended. Coble was the GM of an actual play series being streamed on Twitch to like hundreds of viewers. Everything was going super swimmingly for their 18th episode of their 2nd season until Mr. Champion of Safety sprung an incredibly uncomfortable sexual assault scene on one of his players. Unprompted, and I learned as I was writing the script that that player was also a survivor of sexual assault themselves. To make an incredibly long story that deserves its own video short, Coble just kind of evaded any sort of responsibility for like 10 days until he faced enough public scrutiny to finally come out and apologize, and it was like one of those really lame apologies. Obviously, there's a whole lot more of the story, but safe to say he has been canceled ever since. Fast forward a year, and Luke Crane, remember the guy that this video is kind of about, is the vice president of community over at Kickstarter, which, like, what a title to have, especially for having your roots in tabletop role-playing games. He's working on this project called The Perfect RPG, which is like Who cares? What matters is that he brought his old canceled buddy Adam Koebel along for the ride. And from what I understand of the situation, he hid Koebel's involvement in like a really weird way. Like, he listed all of the contributors to the project by first name, but in reverse alphabetical order. So Adam Koebel would be listed at the bottom to try and hide his involvement. Some terminally online people say that that means that Luke Crane is like super guilty and should also be canceled for life. I am but the reporter on such trash drama, not the judge or jury. I will let you decide. Jumping back to the present, you can totally see why people would be suspicious when Crane came out and said that he wasn't going to be the one designing Dungeon World 2nd Edition. There's suspicion that he's going to bring his old pal Adam Koebel back onto the design team, and he's going to hide his involvement in the Council of Dungeon, as he's calling it. Now, this is all just sort of theory crafting and paranoia. I'm not necessarily saying I believe that he's using the Council of Dungeon to hide Adam Koebel's involvement. He might genuinely just want to turn over design and development to the incredibly passionate Dungeon World community that's kept the game alive. And I think people deserve a chance at redemption. Also, he said that neither Koebel nor Latora are going to be involved in any way, shape, or form with Dungeon World 2.0, and he has done nothing to make me not believe him. Yes, there's a whole scandal from 3 years ago, but that's 3 years ago. People can grow and change. Quite frankly, I'm really stoked for this project. Obviously, this channel is all about Dungeon World. It's been my main RPG for like 3 or 4 years now. I'm sure we're not going to see it fully completed for quite some time, and that's totally okay. It is in the primordial ooze stages of development right now. And some sticklers say there's no need for a 2nd edition, as things like Homebrew World or Chasing Adventure or like Fantasy World have already filled the niche of Dungeon World's successor, and there's nothing that a 2nd edition could offer. But you know what? Them, I don't even care. What do you think, guys? What do you think the direction of Dungeon World 2.0 should be? Do you think Luke Crane is gonna sneak Adam Koebel into the project? Let me know in the comments. But for more reporting on D-Dub's stuff, you should click right here. And thank you so much for watching. Wow.